Hi, I'm Mark Lynch with Foreign Policy's Middle East channel, the project on Middle East political science. I'm sitting here with Stefan Hertog, author of the new book, Princes, Brokers, and Bureaucrats, Oil and the State in Saudi Arabia. And so, Stefan, the first thing I wanted to ask you is what's on the mind of everybody here in Washington? Is Saudi Arabia next?
Well, I think at this stage it's risky for anyone engaged in Middle East policy to make any firm predictions. But I'll take the plunge, and I do think that most of the signs are that they'll weather the crisis, the regime will weather the crisis in the short run. There are, though, significant clouds on the horizon in the mid to long term. I don't think that quite the same ingredient of problems, quite the same composition of problems is in existence in Saudi Arabia as has been in the revolutionary cases of Egypt or Tunisia. You've had some socioeconomic discontent, though not as acutely. You have some discontent with a relatively ossified governing structure, governing elite, but at the same time you have less of a tradition of political mobilization in Saudi society. You have a regime with much more pronounced and expansive powers of patronage, and we've seen that recently with King Abdullah's distribution decrees. And they've been policing the kind of timid attempts at dissidents, at public dissidents, quite successfully. And for the time being, things are quiet there.
Well, where is the opposition on this? There have been a number of petitions demanding political reform. How serious are those demands for change?
With the situation on the Saudi job market, a lot of young Saudis, especially below 24 years of age, are unemployed. Those people have not channeled their discontent into certainly not into a regime change agenda, and in many cases not even into any kind of agenda of political change.
So if you look at Egypt and Tunisia and some of these other cases, things developed incredibly quickly, and the traditional opposition didn't really have the lead role, and they often focused on very specific demands, universal demands like Hosni Mubarak must go, and they didn't need a coherent political agenda to really push those changes. So you've got this youth in Saudi Arabia. There's very high levels of internet penetration, all the discontent you were talking about. Why wouldn't it happen there?
I certainly think that those factors could be midterm ingredients for a more explosive revolutionary situation. But what's lacked in Saudi Arabia and what was more present in Egypt and Tunisia is organizational, mobilizational structures among actually those youth movements. They were not traditional parties, not the traditional dissident networks that you had in Egypt and Tunisia, but still networks that had been operating, mobilizing, dress rehearsing, as it were, the revolution for a number of years. And say the April 6th movement in Egypt had been active for years, had been organizing small-scale demonstrations, trying to hook up with the labor movement. And so that there was certainly an organizational infrastructure there when the right moment came that does not exist on the same level in Saudi Arabia.
Well, what about King Abdullah's offer? What does that do to Saudi Arabia? All the money that he threw at the demands of the protesters.
I think it's quite a typical reaction. It's quite in character for the Saudi regime. They have reacted similarly to previous severe domestic crises after the occupation of the Grand Mosque in Mecca in 1979, after the admission of US troops on Saudi soil in the course of the 1991 war against Saddam. And it's kind of a knee-jerk patronage reaction of throwing money at the problem that, at least in the short run, actually has worked fairly well in the past and probably looks fairly likely to work this time around, because it does deal with some of the socioeconomic grievances of young unemployed people who now get unemployment assistance or are about to get it, higher minimum wage in the public sector, housing program making more housing available for especially young Saudis who can't afford mortgages. But it is a reaction that to some extent might kick the problem down the road and make it more severe in perhaps 3, 5 or 7 years' time, when the enlarged fiscal burden that those new patronage obligations create might lead to fiscal strain in Saudi Arabia, and will in the meantime also have led to greatly increased expectations among young Saudis. And the youth cohorts that are entering the labor market every year are huge and getting huger by the year.
So you think Saudi Arabia's time might not be now, but it might be coming?
I do think that there is potential for a critical situation within a couple of years, although it's by no means a foregone conclusion. It'll depend on the cohesiveness of the elite, how quickly they can react. There's a danger of fragmentation and stalemate, but there might also be a new player emerging at the helm of the ruling family who's more dynamic. It'll also depend on what happens in the rest of the region, because Saudis are very aware of what's happening in the Arab republics. And if things there go pear-shaped, then the bar, as it were, that the Al Saud will have to cross to legitimize themselves as rulers will be lower than it arguably is right now, that the hopes of the youth in the region are really pretty high.
All right, thanks, Stefan. Very interesting. This has been Mark Lynch, Foreign Policy Magazine's Middle East channel and the Project on Middle East Political Science.